In 2006, Dr. Duane Graveline self-published a book entitled Lipitor, Thief of Memory. In it, he details his experience with a phenomenon known as Transient Global Amnesia, very rare. And he lays out a good case that, in his case, it was caused by his use of Lipitor. So in this video, you're going to hear a first-person account of what it's like to experience Transient Global Amnesia. Stay tuned. So let's talk about Dr. Graveline very briefly. He was a astronaut, technically. He was one of the few who actually never went out into space. He self-published a lot of books on statins, the one I mentioned already, Lipitor, Thief of Memory, Statin Drug Side Effects, the Statin Damage Crisis, and the Dark Side of Statins. Now, there's a lot of reasons why somebody might self-publish versus going through a regular publisher. I'm not going to guess what his motivations were. Sometimes people self-publish, their works are looked down upon a little bit, and I guess I don't have any feeling one way or the other. I did notice in these books a little bit of lack of editing in a few places that maybe an editor would have picked up. And also, full disclosure here, let's look at a quote from Wikipedia.org, which is actually a quote from his obituary. It's a long and sad story, a brilliant man who was deeply flawed. And that is a quote from one of his wives. He was married 6 times. The only reason I bring this up is because if I don't, people will say, hey, you know, you're listening to some extremists who had difficulties in his life. Look, none of us are perfect. I'm not judging him. I think he made a good case for his transient global amnesia being caused by the Lipitor. So what is transient global amnesia? Well, it's a temporary near total disruption of short-term memory. Patient can only recall the last few moments of consciousness, and it generally lasts between 2 to 8 hours, can last for 24 hours. Now, I actually condensed this down from a much longer description, but getting rid of all the excess words and verbs and stuff like that, it essentially comes down to this. So how do you diagnose this? Well, actually, it's very difficult. It's not something that you can just say, oh, we look at this, that's transient global amnesia. It's really kind of a diagnosis of elimination. But here's the criteria. It's going to be witnessed. The onset should be witnessed by a capable observer. You can't just say, hey, I blacked out and I can't remember several hours of existence. That could very well be TGA, which is what I'll call it from now on. But it doesn't get diagnosed without all the evidence. Absent other cognitive impairment. In other words, when you're in an episode of TGA, apparently you're able to still function as a human being. You just may be doing things repetitively. I actually have a friend who had a TGA episode and he just drove somewhere random before he snapped out of it. No focal neurological deficits. In other words, no drooping of the face, no aphasia, things that might indicate a stroke. Epilepsy and recent head injuries have to be ruled out and resolved within 24 hours. So here's a first-person account, and this came as a shock to me. It was around the time that this channel actually started to take off. I was getting thousands of views on one of my videos, and I happened to personally experience a transient global amnesia event in February of 2023. I received top-notch medical care. I recognized, or my wife recognized, that I was going into this, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I was able to get to the hospital right away, and they were able to observe most of the period of my blackout. This is just kind of an amazing coincidence that this would occur to me. Now, there are some caveats. First of all, I want to be clear, this episode was not induced by statins. I haven't been on statins for 5.5 years, so I don't see how any way that this episode could be induced by that. So even though it's very rare, statins had nothing to do with it. So why am I telling you this? Well, I'm presenting this to give you an idea of what the experience is like. Another caveat is I am in a Lyme disease vaccine clinical trial, and it appears after consulting with the principal investigator and the assistant principal investigator that that also has nothing to do with this. The last time I received a shot, which 50-50 chance it was a placebo anyway, was a month and a half before this event. So we don't think that has anything to do with it. So I'm going to just give you a timeline of what happened to me. And in this timeline, there's going to be a couple colors shown. What's in white is when I had normal memory, and what's in red was when I had memory issues. This timeline covers about a 7-hour period. First thing that happened was I was in my basement looking at a structure that I'd built for the ceiling. We're putting in drop ceilings and it needed some kind of support to get around the vents and everything. And I had a brief memory event, which I don't remember, but my wife does. I actually, had called her down to the basement to show her what change I was thinking of making. And then I asked her, who moved the furniture? Somebody put plastic over the furniture and moved it all. Well, she and I had done that a week before, and I remember doing it. Now I remember doing it. But for that moment, I had this bizarre little memory hiccup. And she thought I was joking around, to tell you the truth. And, after she said, no, we did that. And then she went back upstairs, and I think she was a little concerned. A few moments later, I recognized that something was not right. I came up out of the basement. I sat down on the floor. I was even thinking of kind of reenacting it and filming that, but that would just seem too corny to me. So I sat down on the floor and I announced to her that something was not right. And I vaguely remember her saying, should I call an ambulance? Everything after that for the next several hours, I have absolutely no memory of. Apparently, the paramedics came, the EMTs came, they came through our front door, they sat down and talked to me, and I actually walked out to the ambulance. I was alert, awake, coherent. I walked out to the ambulance, but I have absolutely no memory of that. So the PT here means patient climbs into the ambulance. Got to the emergency room at the local hospital, and I gotta say, I'm so glad this happened in the United States. I got top-notch care from that emergency room and the hospital in general. Like I've said before, I'm not anti-medical establishment, and if anything weird happens to me, I want it to be where I am, where I can get treatment. And these people were just fantastic because they don't get to see this very often. And this was a rare case where it was detected going into it and they could observe it. So we took a bunch of tests. I took, they did CAT scans, they did EEGs. Later, after I'd come out of it, we did MRIs because I couldn't keep on forgetting short term. They could never get through the MRI because I'd be saying, what the hell is going on all the time? So all those ruled out a stroke, ruled out epilepsy, ruled out a seizure. So for the next 4 hours, I was put through various tests, and there was some confusion finding my wife. I mean, she was there in the waiting room, but they lost track of her for a minute because she went out to the car. So she didn't actually get to see me until 4 hours later. And at that point, apparently I went into she called it Groundhog Day. It was a nightmare for her because she's saying, if this is going to go on for the rest of forever, I'm going to go absolutely nuts. I entered a 1-minute loop where every minute I asked the same 6 questions. And apparently I'd been doing that for a while because the hospital gave me a note, because I was able to read, saying, you're at the hospital, your wife is aware, you're having trouble remembering things, we got a CT of your head and some blood work, we're just waiting for the results, everything is okay. Well, that last one was just kind of moral support because at that point, there's no way they could know that everything was okay because they didn't have the results yet. But, hey, kudos to them for trying to make me feel good. So I entered this 1-minute loop asking these questions. And on the last instance, which is the only one I remember, so as far as I'm concerned, I blacked out for 4 hours. And I looked over, and I kind of knew I must have been in an emergency room, but I looked over at my wife and said, am I at Cooley Dickinson Hospital? And she said, yeah. And I went through, I said, well, what's going on? And I think I may have remembered from the previous cycle, somebody in the emergency room saying global transient amnesia. Now, being very familiar with that phenomenon just from reading Dr. Graveline's books, my first thought was, that could be caused by Lipitor, but I haven't taken that in 5 years. And I don't know if I said that every time. I may have, for all I know. But at that point, finally, the time loop broke. I must have been in a Star Trek episode where, they get looping in time and everything. There's several episodes of that type. And I finally broke out of it. And they spent they actually kept me in the hospital for 3 or 4 days just to make sure they eliminated everything. And, they eliminated a viral infection. They took a spinal tap, gave me a freaking headache, but hey, that's life, So they did their best because a diagnosis of transient global amnesia, like I said, is a diagnosis of elimination. You eliminate everything else and you finally shrug your shoulders and say, it's a brain hiccup. Go back on with your life, though I am going to be seeing a neurologist soon. So I'm going to talk about some statistics of this phenomenon, but I do want to say that the treatment was fantastic in all aspects except for one. And this is typical of what happens when you're dealing with medical professionals and you've actually tried learning about something on your own. Because while I was laying there in bed, I naturally looked up transient global amnesia, even though I was kind of familiar with what it was in general. Yeah, I didn't have the details. And the doctor came around and I wanted to ask her, I wanted to mention to her that I knew something was going on, and that's actually not typical of transient global amnesia as you enter that state. So I was just asking if was that sufficient enough to say that's not exactly what I had? Well, before I could even get to the question, I said, hey, I was looking up transient global amnesia. She said, why are you looking that up? That's not any diagnosis that you have. Really frustrating because typical medical professional gets really upset, especially they're busy people. They've got, probably tens of patients they have to visit during the day. She's the resident professional there. And I'm sure it just makes their job harder in the short run. And in fairness, their job at that point was to make sure I was okay and didn't have something else. So they're not prepared to diagnose this. But I just thought it interesting because I was released a few hours later, and the papers that they gave me, the discharge paper, said right at the top, transient global amnesia. So the annoying thing was I never got my question out. I had what I thought was an intelligent question was, hey, this seems to be atypical of that. Could you, confirm or deny? They weren't prepared to talk about it, so I have to go to a neurologist. Another thing that happened that was concurrent with this is I've never had a blood pressure problem, but my blood pressure went way up. And in the interest of being cautious, I am, at least temporarily, on a blood pressure medication to make sure that stays down. It is back to normal now, but of course I'm on medication, so now I've got to get weaned off that under doctor supervision. So I just warn you, high blood pressure is nothing to fool around with. We can argue about statins all day. I'm going to be very careful with that, and I'm just going to make sure that it is safe for me to get off that stuff because I don't like taking any maintenance drugs at all. I'll take Tylenol for a headache or something on very rare occasions. If I have a cold, I should own stock in the NyQuil people. Those are the sorts of things that I will do in short term. I don't want to be on anything long term if I can at all avoid it. So let's look at these statistics. Transient global amnesia is very difficult to diagnose, like I said. For one thing, it's very rare. I see all sorts of different frequencies between 5 and 23 per 100,000 people in the United States. So that's from like 0.005% to maybe 5 times that, 1/40%. Repeat episodes are very hard to diagnose because the numbers are getting so small. When you have that few people experiencing this, it's very hard for them to get hands on good data. I've seen it called rare. Well, rare technically should be like 1 in 1,000 or less. But kind of in relative terms, a colloquial use of the word rare. I've seen 3%, I've seen 10%, I've seen 23% for recurrence. In other words, if you had it once, what are the chances that you're going to have it again? So let's just use that 10%, I'm going to use 10 out of 100,000 as the frequency of this phenomenon occurring per year per person in the United States, and a 10% recurrence rate after that. So it starts out very rare, but if it's happened, it's actually going to be much more likely, though still a very low probability that's going to happen again. So if we have 350 million Americans, then there may be 35,000 cases of this per year. And at a 10% recurrence level, 3,500 repeat second instances. Not necessarily in the year, but in the person's lifetime. So that what makes the statistics very hard to gather because now, time frames are all skewed and everything else. Third instances at 10% of that. In other words, if you had 2, I still think it's probably 10% chance you're going to get another one. Somewhere in that range. There'd be 350 people who have a third instance and maybe 39 people who have 4 or more. That would be 35 more plus 3.5 out of 350 million Americans. So that is a very, very rare phenomenon. And I wouldn't say I'm fortunate to have seen it happen. It happens to fall in with what I'm doing here. That's purely a coincidence. It's a coincidence I kind of wish I didn't have to experience. I kind of wish my wife didn't have to experience it because for me, I just have a gap in my memory, a 5-hour gap in my memory. I don't remember the ambulance ride. I don't remember any of the earlier tests. I do remember once I snapped out of it, I had to go into the MRI machine because I get claustrophobic. Fortunately, they gave me something to calm me down. They pipe in some 60s music. I count the number of songs and keep my eyes closed and say, I'm not going to look because if I open my eyes, I'm going to see that I'm in a confined space. So that's how I handled it, and I got through it and everything came out normal. I still could have confirmed some of those because some of the things they told me actually sounded too good to be true. They told me I had absolutely no blockage in my carotid arteries. I'm like, I'm 65 years old. How can I have no blockages? So I don't think I asked the question right or that they understood what I was asking. So before I finish this, I just want to talk about statistics and how statistics can be used and misused to get us to believe whatever we want to believe. And we've got to always be aware of that. Because let's look at this statement. And I'm assuming a 10% recurrence rate. There is a 90% chance you won't have a second event. Sounds pretty good. I mean, I wouldn't bet my life on not having a second event, but I like those odds. It's better than 50-50 or 90% chance that I will, so pretty good. Let's look at this statement. Your chance of a second event is 1,000 times that of the general population. We looked at the numbers. Those two statements are actually mathematically the same when you look at the background numbers between it. Yeah, there's only a 10% chance that I'll have it again, but there was only a 1/100% chance that I was going to have it in the first place. So now my probability of having another event is 1,000 times that of the general population. What's this got to do with statins other than, Duane Graveline had this experience? Well, my speculation is that statin-induced cases probably occur and recur at a higher rate. I have no idea by how much. I don't know that anybody studied it. I don't know that it's possible to study it with such an infrequent incidence that they have with this. It was just fascinating to me to go through this. It was scarier for my wife than it was for me. I don't wish it on anybody. Fortunately, I'm retired, so when they told me that, you better not drive for a while, yeah, I got that. That's not going to cramp my lifestyle. There was a guy in the bed next to me who had actually had a seizure. They told him he couldn't drive for a while. He was young. He had a young daughter. His wife was there. It was very traumatic for them, very difficult for them to wrap their heads around maybe going 6 months or for life without being able to drive. It's something that I can handle for now at least, and it seems more likely that I will be able to drive again, but for the safety of the public, I'm not doing it until I at least go to the neurologist. So that was my experience with transient global amnesia. It's something I absolutely never expected would happen to me. Now, I did have memory problems and that sort of thing when I was on statins, but it has been 5.5 years, so I'm sure this was unrelated to statins unless it did some hidden permanent damage in the background that I don't know how to prove or disprove that one way or the other. In any case, if you appreciate this content, please like, share, and comment on this topic or anything else you'd like to hear about. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.